Senator Rennick.
Hi, how are you going? How much money does the federal government pay free-to-air TV each year for advertising?
I don't think either one of us on the call could answer that question. Lorena, because she only asks for 9, and myself, because Free TV doesn't collect that information.
Okay, no, that's fine. I mean, let's just assume it's in the millions of dollars. Would you not assume, would it be fair to assume that there's an inherent conflict of interest between what the mainstream media report as news and what the government wants reported at news, given that mainstream media relies on government for a significant part of its advertising revenue?
I'm happy to answer that, Angela. There's no conflict whatsoever on the part of the journalists or their editorial teams. And I would say the reason is this. Regardless of advertising spend, a journalist will still follow a story, and the publishers and broadcasters will still publish those stories, even if they are critical of the government. And I would submit, especially if they are critical of the government. There are internal mechanisms regarding journalistic integrity and editorial editorial decisions, where those commercial considerations do not come into play.
Well,
as soon as there is...
Well, that contradicts what I've been told by producers at your network and at other networks, commercial networks, who've been told that they haven't been allowed to report what they've been wanted to report. They've had to run it by lawyers. They've been threatened by commercial interests. So I guess I'll come back to it. I disagree with your assertion that there is no conflict of interest. If you're receiving money from the government in the form of advertising revenue, there is inherent conflict of interest. That's not to impute that every one of your journalists will be, inverted commas, bought off, but do you accept that there is a risk of pressure and peer pressure because the government can exert influence because of that advertising revenue?
Say no.
You don't think that there's... You've never had... You don't think there's never been a situation whereby commercial interests, the accountants or whatever, the CFO has come and said, we've got this big advertising contract from the government. We need to tell our journalists to, not go there because it's going to be a bad look. That's never happened.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, because I'm aware of it.
Right.
And I've been... Sorry, go on.
Yeah, my understanding is the government spend on advertising is not so great as to have any influence whatsoever on our reporting on government matters. And I think I can turn to every story we've written about the government for the last decade to show that that's not the case. We are highly critical of the government, with respect, because that is our role as the fourth estate. There's no reason why any journalist would think that maybe some money in the accounting department that puts pressure on them to not run a story.
Okay, so it's not the journalist who's receiving the money. I'm not for a minute suggesting that. The journalist is being pressured by their producers, and this is what I've encountered on a number of occasions, I'll say less than 5, but it's happened more than 3 or 4 times, whereby they have been unable to publish a story because they've been told by their producers not to publish it. And that's been through direct pressure either from commercial interests or from government interests.
There can be commercial interests and government interests that fight a story being run, but I don't believe the advertising spend of the government with that broadcaster or publisher has ever been a factor taken into account in my experience. There are certainly defamation threats that we take into account. There are, other threats of people ceasing to cooperate with us as a source for future stories if we run a story today that's negative about them. Those pressures are to be expected, but those don't relate to the government spend on advertising.
Okay, do you accept that there's a inherent conflict of interest in this bill in that it suits your agenda? Because if you can shut down digital platforms, they are a direct competition to mainstream media.
I think the purpose of the bill is to stop deliberate misinformation and disinformation. That's not something that, like, obviously the news organisations engage in, and it's not something those platforms engage in. My understanding is this was always directed at members of the public spreading misinformation and disinformation.
But that's the problem. That's the problem, because the definition of misinformation and disinformation is arbitrary. It's decided by the government, who has the power to revoke your licence, I might add, who spends millions of dollars in advertising revenue. So they are a client of yours. There is inherent conflict of interest in this bill that is going to favour the big end of town and take away, has the potential to silence people who have their feeds, they're either deplatformed on social media or have their, their feeds pushed down. So, and unfortunately, the individuals on these who are subscribers to these digital platforms don't have the power to actually have any right of appeal with the digital platform. So it's all very well saying this bill saying we're not going to go after the individuals. They don't have to, because the digital platform will, and they're all based overseas. So do you not accept that there's the risk in this bill for censorship to suit the big end of town?
I think there's a risk in this bill of censorship, but who it benefits, I'm not sure. And I can't speak for all the broadcasters, but I certainly understand that our primary position is that this bill should not be passed. Our primary position is this bill is censorship. But if this bill is passed, there should at least be an exception for the news organisations who are trusted news sources in this country. Because to use this bill to censor journalism would, in our submission, be a mistake.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Authorised G. Rennick People First Chermside.